Hello, welcome to On the Record. My name is Adam Jasser, and today my guest is Michael Carpenter, a former senior advisor to President Joe Biden on the National Security Council. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, I want to ask you first, do you share President Trump's conviction that Ukraine can win the war and take territory back?
I absolutely do. In fact, I wrote an article about it in July saying Ukraine
so you were first.
Can still win.
Okay.
Because I think this narrative, which is coming from also Russian propaganda over the course of the last year or two, has been very active in trying to dissuade people from the view that Ukraine can win. It's sort of a defeatist narrative. Absolutely, with the right resources and the right capabilities, Ukraine can absolutely win.
Are these things in place now? The resources, the capabilities?
No, unfortunately not. And Ukraine still has a large budget hole that needs to be plugged, but most importantly, they need cutting-edge capabilities. And throughout the course of the war, since the very beginning, since February of 2022, they've been fighting the Russians outmatched in terms of military capabilities, not having the same level of fighter jets, not having the same level of tanks, not having the same level of armor. That needs to catch up, and Western countries have to do that. And that's where Mr. Trump has not been providing Ukraine with the support that it badly needs.
But now they're saying they will. They will provide the long-range missiles, as far as I understand, or is this...
This is, they're doing only a tiny fraction. So far, what the Trump administration has authorized is $500 million in sales to NATO of equipment. In the Biden administration, you'll recall, there were $70 billion, or roughly $500 million every 2 weeks. From the Biden administration in terms of assistance. And that was assistance that we were giving to Ukraine. What Trump is authorizing is a one-time sale of $500 million. So the scale is vastly different.
But Trump is arguing that the Europeans should be providing a lot of these capabilities, and he has a point. Your administration was saying the same.
Absolutely. No, he's got an absolutely good point that Europeans need to step up and provide more. But if this is an existential war that impinges on global security, which it does, then the United States should see that its interest is also in supporting Ukraine to win and not standing on the sidelines.
But pardon me for saying this, but your administration was very often criticized for being slow with some of the deliveries and being a little hesitant.
That's why we find this moment to be so hypocritical, because the previous administration, the Biden administration where I worked, was criticized for not giving enough. And rightly so. At various moments in the war, I believe that they should have actually ramped up support for Ukraine when they didn't. But they gave $70 billion worth of assistance to Ukraine. The Trump administration has given $0 of assistance to Ukraine. So the very same people that were criticizing in the past are now praising Trump for trying to preside over some sort of a peace deal, which is frankly a fantasy. It's a chimera.
Yes, it's interesting that the ceasefire is no longer on the table. Nobody talks about ceasefire anymore, or am I missing something?
No, I think you're right. I think President Trump has slowly but surely come to the conclusion that a lot of us have had for a long time, which is that he's not going to be able to do a deal if that deal involves Ukraine giving up a quarter of its land. That's just simply, Ukraine is not ready to capitulate. So that deal is not to be had, nor should it be had.
So is his resolve going to stiffen now, or do you think this is just a temporary U-turn? And
my view, so with the Trump administration all along, I have held to the view, and I continue to hold to it, look at what he does, not what he says. Right now he says Ukraine can win. Frankly, this to me looks like it's a pivot from the administration to be able to withdraw the U.S. from the negotiations, leave the issue to the Europeans to handle, and then the Trump
administration... And the cost as well.
And the cost as well. And the U.S. basically disengages. You've seen our national defense strategy now prioritizes the Western Hemisphere as priority number one. The Indo-Pacific is number two, and then Euro-Atlantic security is a distant third.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned this. This has not been published yet, this national strategy. There are some reports out there about the content. You know, I read a comment somewhere that this is actually back to the Orwell's novel 1984, where you had America withdrawing. Perhaps they will keep the UK as the sort of advanced, how do they call it? The
vanguard.
The vanguard or the airstrip or whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe Greenland, about which Mr. Trump obsesses, and then Eurasia is left to Russia and China, basically.
It's essentially two things. It's a return to sort of the Monroe Doctrine days when the United States was preoccupied with its hemisphere. And I say it's consciously because it is sort of a sphere of influence type of mentality that underlies this new thinking, not just in the NDS, but within the administration as a whole. And if you follow that to its logical conclusion, it's actually very scary because then that suggests that Russia has the right to a sphere of influence on its periphery and that China does as well. And all this talk about the China hawks in the Trump administration is actually now proving to be false because those officials are, of course, still there.
But they're in minority.
Well, they're inconsequential. So people like Bridge Colby in the Pentagon or Mike Waltz, who was national security advisors now at the UN, they're not the ones calling the shots on policy. It's Trump who's calling the shots on policy, and his policy is very clear. We're going to fight. We're in, as he says it, we're in a war with narco traffickers. That's why we have, immigration and customs agents deployed to U.S. cities like Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
And then there are domestic enemies and
enemies, and the rest of the world can take care of itself.
So that, by implication, we've been talking about Ukraine, but that's bad news for Taiwan as well.
It's very bad news for both Ukraine and Taiwan for obvious reasons. And in fact, if you look at the Trump administration and their record on Taiwan so far, they have canceled a $400 million military assistance package for Taiwan. So not only are they canceling aid for Ukraine, but they're canceling aid for Taiwan, and then President Lai was also advised not to travel to the United States by President Trump and his administration. So the signals right now, I think, are flashing red as well for our Taiwanese partners.
Do you think the Chinese are going to take advantage of it and actually do something, or are they going to just sit back and wait until this materializes?
So I don't know what's in the minds of Xi Jinping and others in Beijing, but I know that whenever a power like China or Russia perceives weakness, they see opportunity. And so the same that is true of Putin over the years is true of Xi.
So now going back to Europe and NATO and Ukraine, has Putin overplayed his hand with Trump, and now the drone incursions and other provocations are signs of desperation, or is he still testing resolve? How do you see that?
He's absolutely testing resolve, but at the same time, I do think that what we've seen from Putin is a strategically less savvy set of moves over the course of the last few months. Frankly, if Putin had been strategically savvy, he probably would have done some sort of deal with Trump in Alaska and put the pressure on Ukraine, which would have then had a very hard time trying to justify a deal that would have given up some of its territory. The fact that Putin was not able to do that deal, and the fact that he continues to provoke NATO with drone incursions into Poland or fighter jets into Estonian airspace proves that he's just sort of congenitally hostile to the Western alliance. And that is actually, thank God, that is sort of preventing him from doing a deal that I think would have been a disaster for Ukraine at the end of the day.
So now Ukraine has a tactical advantage when it comes to potential future deal.
I think so. I mean, I think it's unfortunate that the United States is on the sidelines and that they're not actively supporting Ukraine, the rhetoric notwithstanding. But in terms of military assistance, as I said, there's nothing that's flowing to Ukraine. I think that's very unfortunate. But if the Europeans, and this is a crucial question, but if the Europeans finally get their act together and use the immobilized Russian assets that are held in Western jurisdictions, that is a game changer in terms of widening Ukraine's runway and dramatically narrowing Russia's.
And do you believe that NATO's response so far to these incursions, to drones, to airplanes violating NATO airspace, is this too timid, or is this the right response?
Well, it remains to be seen. So there's two aspects to the response that need to be considered. The first aspect is a long-term proposition which involves building up the integrated air and missile defense architecture on the eastern flank.
Yeah, but that takes time.
That takes a long time and hundreds of millions of dollars. But it needs to happen. It's very important. The more immediate term problem is to come up with rules of engagement. So what do pilots do in the case of an actual incursion? And my view is you send some warning signals, you demarche Moscow, you make clear in the public arena that this is unacceptable, and that if it continues and if it's a danger, that some of these projectiles or planes will be shot down. And then, after that period is over, you have to be prepared to act. And that will be the ultimate test. But I think we're getting closer and closer to the day where if a Russian plane incurs again into airspace, if it is signaled and it is warned and it continues on its flight path, then the inevitable has to happen to show that this territory is inviolable.
But is it true that in general Western countries are a little bit reluctant to respond symmetrically to what Russia is doing? In other words, the Russians keep provoking here and there, there's sabotage and all of this, and
very true.
The West is saying, oh, you know, the threshold is really high for us to react. Shouldn't that threshold come down?
Well, Western countries are very afraid of sort of falling into the escalation trap. So Russia engages in provocations, and then immediately the West responds, and we're off to the races in terms of some sort of kinetic conflict. And you know, Western powers, their politicians are accountable to their publics. Most European publics do not want war with Russia. So
and
it's
democracies tend to be slower.
They're slower, and they're also a little bit more risk averse than authoritarian regimes. And that is as it should be. But there comes a time where you have to impose deterrence, and that means taking the difficult steps. You know, Turkey in 2015 also warned Russia several times that if Russian planes incurred into its airspace, eventually one of them would get shot down. And that's what the Turks eventually did.
But then later they apologized for that and tried the pilot who shot down the Russian plane.
They apologized. They sought to have a modus vivendi. And in fact, Russian forces also killed Turkish troops inside Syria in 2017 and then again in 2020. So there were ramifications to this. But as an action to deter further airspace incursions, it was successful. Now, Turkey and Russia have had a long-term strategic competition. So this was part and parcel of that. Western countries, unfortunately, are in a very similar boat.
So to keep on this topic, we now hear reports that some of the drones that were spotted over airports in Western Europe, not just on the eastern flank, that actually were launched from the Shadow Fleet, Russia's Shadow Fleet. So to me, as a non-expert, it's puzzling that, for example, the West doesn't try out shutting off Russian traffic in the Baltic entirely. You know, so again, I'm trying to make a point that some of these reactions seem to be very hesitant.
You're right, and a lot of the reactions, and a lot of the sanctions, by the way, on Russia have also been hesitant or weak or filled with loopholes, and therefore much less consequential than Western politicians like to portray them as being.
Yes, there's this divergence between the rhetoric and actual action.
And the Shadow Fleet is the perfect example. If we were serious about imposing an oil price cap on Russia to strangulate their oil revenues, then we could do it, but we would have to have very robust enforcement. Very few Western nations are willing to enforce the oil price cap in a way that would make it truly effective as a cost imposition measure.
But your administration was also against a sort of tough cap on oil prices. Well,
I mean, we're the administration that first imposed the oil price cap in the first place.
But then at the level that...
It's a matter, but what I'm talking about is not just imposing the cap, but then enforcing it with robust enforcement. And frankly, a lot of these ships are flowing through the Baltic. So it's really up to European nations. And this goes to the criticism that Trump has levied against Europeans, and that frankly, the previous administration as well, that Europe needs to patrol its waters and needs to enforce the rules of the road when it comes to this Shadow Fleet.
So in a sense, you're saying President Trump takes some credit for waking Europeans up and maybe prodding them a little harder than President Biden was able to.
I mean, it's a rude awakening, let's put it that way. But it is, if at the end of this, if we come out after the end of this Trump term with a Europe that is stronger, more militarily capable, investing in its industrial base, that's a good thing. But not because the U.S. is disengaging, but because they feel that this is necessary for their own security.
But going back to this Monroe Doctrine, which was, limiting U.S. interests to America, basically. If that were to be true and continued for several years, is the logical conclusion that NATO is going to become a European project much more than transatlantic one?
I think you can anticipate that for the next couple of years, NATO deterrence and defense is going to fall more to the hands of Europeans than it ever has in its history since 1949. But remember, the Trump administration has 3.5 years left. That's a long time. But eventually there will be a new administration in power in Washington, and it may have a different view of the value of NATO and U.S. investments in the alliance.
But let me turn this question around.
Just remember, because the Trump administration is an aberration from a history of U.S. engagement in Europe since 1949, before actually, since World War II.
I have to be the devil's advocate.
Please.
Maybe what we saw under Joe Biden was a temporary reprieve from America's tendency to self-isolate.
Well, America has a long history of isolationist trends. However, I would argue consistently since FDR, so since the Second World War, if not before, we have been heavily engaged on the world stage. That's quite a long track record. We're coming up on 80 years of track record of engagement in Europe, the Marshall Plan and everything that followed.
But Trump dismisses it. And a lot of the Republican establishment these days doesn't think that way
And
anymore.
there is a strong segment of American society that does believe, and not inappropriately, but they do believe that we should be investing more at home. And those of them that see how much European welfare states invest in their populations say, why can't we have a similar degree of a similar standard of living? And on that score, they're right.
Exactly. So your point still is that America will sooner or later re-engage with the world rather than sink into isolation.
I'm not predicting when it'll happen, but I think there is a strong structural set of reasons why the United States remains. So, for example, take our defense industry. Our defense industry sells a lot of equipment in Europe. To be sustainable over time, those firms are going to want to continue to do that business. Our tech industry is also heavily dependent on sales to Europe. In fact, our economies are so intertwined. On a yearly basis, the U.S.-European economic financial investment sales relationship is $9.5 trillion. It's a huge economy. And so for those reasons, there will be actors who will call for re-engaging in the European space, regardless of what the politicians say.
Right. Finally, the issue of nuclear proliferation, because as events unfold, there is growing skepticism in Europe whether the U.S. nuclear deterrent is still relevant for Europe. Are you afraid that this is going to spin out of control and European powers will reignite their nuclear programs? They had them in the 50s and 60s, and some of them were on the cusp of having nuclear arms. Is this going to happen, or?
I would put it like this. I think in the coming decade or couple decades, we will see essentially the unraveling of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Russia's war against Ukraine has essentially sowed the seeds of the destruction of the NPT, and there's unfortunately no going back to it, because the lesson that has been learned is that if you give up your nuclear deterrence, you are fair game. Great powers can come in and attack you.
This is Ukraine. You're talking about Ukraine.
I'm talking about Ukraine, but it could potentially apply to any other state. Look at what happened with Iran, right? So I think the lessons, whether they're the right lessons or the wrong lessons, but the ones that are being learned are we need to develop a nuclear deterrent to prevent attacks on sovereign states. And I see more states around the world, whether it's Saudi Arabia.
They just reached a deal with Pakistan, right?
Right.
Which
right.
We don't know what it is about.
We don't know all the details.
Yeah.
Turkey, but also NATO countries on the eastern flank as well should be, in fact, thinking about how best to secure their long-term sovereignty.
Poland is thinking about that, as you know, and Poland has been trying to get on the nuclear sharing thing, but that was shot down by J.D. Vance just like with one sentence, basically.
So I think there is merit in having eastern flank countries more engaged in nuclear burden sharing, as opposed to trying to develop a weapon and violating the NPT. But I think you will see states around the world begin to consider developing weapons, because that is the ultimate guarantee. And so in that world where this starts to proliferate, then then it creates a sort of a vicious circle where more and more states want to do it because their regional rivals are already developing such a capability. And that's frankly, that's a scary world to be in.
What is going to be the telltale? How are we going to tell that we're approaching this scenario?
Well, a lot of this will be done in covert, so we may not necessarily know. but it's part and parcel of the fragmentation of the international order and the decline of rules that govern how states interact. And so, we will see at some point another country declare that it is nuclear capable. I don't know when that's going to be, but probably within a decade or two. And then we're going to be off to the races. Unfortunately, I wish it were otherwise, but just analytically, I think this is where we're headed.
But Trump keeps mentioning non-proliferation as his goal, and he talks quite convincingly about his fear of the nuclear Armageddon. He used it against the Biden administration, for example, but he's saying it now as well.
Well,
is he genuine in this, do you think?
I can't question his motivations. I think he's probably very genuine in his concern. I think what that calls for, however, is strengthening Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity to essentially reverse the lapse in enforcement of the Budapest Memorandum, which is where we are today. The Budapest Memorandum is dead. It has not been enforced. Now, it was a political deal. It was not a treaty. There was no mutual defense clause. But nonetheless, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. You can blame the Ukrainian politicians who signed up to that deal, but ultimately it's also on the international community to make them whole.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
This was all we've got for you in On the Record. See you next week.